Briar Ridge, a small, religious town nestled in the heart of the Midwest, had always prided itself on its moral foundations. Church bells rang every Sunday, calling families to worship at St. Michael's, the town's centerpiece. The townspeople knew each other by name, and the sense of community was strong, rooted in faith and tradition. On the surface, it was a place of peace, where people trusted in the good nature of their neighbors. But in the heart of Briar Ridge, a dark secret festered. For years, Father Gabriel Moreno, the town's beloved Catholic priest, and Officer Brian Connolly, a married man with 2 children, had harbored a forbidden love affair. It was a secret that would unravel in tragedy, leading to a double murder that left the town in shock. This is the story of how guilt, secrecy, and the fear of exposure can turn a quiet town into the setting of a deadly crime. A crime that tore apart not only 2 families, but an entire community. What began as an affair hidden in the shadows would explode into violence, leaving the residents of Briar Ridge forever changed. Father Gabriel Moreno, a 45-year-old Catholic priest, had served the people of Briar Ridge for 15 years. His deep commitment to the church and his congregation earned him a place of respect within the community. He was known for his kindness, his involvement in charity work, and his steadfast dedication to the faith. Gabriel had a calming presence, one that drew people to him, seeking advice and spiritual guidance. But behind his gentle facade was a man torn apart by a secret he could no longer deny. Since his early years in the priesthood, Gabriel had struggled with his sexual identity. He had taken vows of celibacy and had committed his life to God, believing that his devotion to the church would suppress the desires he buried deep within. But as time went on, the internal conflict grew more intense. When Officer Brian Connolly entered his life, that conflict would come to the forefront. Gabriel's guilt consumed him, but the pull toward Brian was too strong to resist. The relationship, both passionate and destructive, would ultimately lead Gabriel down a path he could never have foreseen. Brian Connolly, 38 years old, was a well-respected member of the Briar Ridge Police Department. He had served for over a decade, earning the trust of his colleagues and the admiration of the town's residents. Married to Mary for over 12 years, Brian was seen as the ideal family man. Together, they had 2 young children, and on the outside, their lives seemed perfect. But beneath this facade, Brian had lived with a secret for years. He had always struggled with his attraction to men. When Brian first met Father Gabriel through the church, the connection between them was immediate. Their relationship began as a friendship rooted in their shared dedication to helping the community, but it quickly turned into something much more dangerous. For Brian, this was the first time he had acted on his feelings, and the weight of the affair weighed heavily on him. As the affair progressed, Brian became increasingly distant from his wife, neglecting his duties as a husband and father as he sank deeper into his hidden life with Gabriel. Mary Connolly, 36, was the glue that held her family together. A stay-at-home mother, she dedicated her life to raising her children and supporting her husband. Deeply involved in St. Michael's Church, Mary was known for her charity work and her involvement in the local PTA. Her life seemed picture-perfect, and she took pride in the life she and Brian had built together. But as Brian began to pull away, Mary's once solid foundation began to crack. Over the past few months, Mary had noticed the changes in Brian's behavior. He was coming home late, spending more time away from the family, and his once warm demeanor had grown cold and distant. Mary tried to convince herself that it was just stress from work, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. As Brian's absences became more frequent, her suspicions grew, though she couldn't have imagined the dark secret he was hiding. It all began innocently enough. On September 14, 2015, Briar Ridge hosted its annual charity event, organized by St. Michael's Church. The event brought together people from all walks of life to support the town's homeless community. Father Gabriel Moreno had always taken the lead on these charitable initiatives, and it was during this event that Officer Brian Connolly and Father Gabriel first truly connected. Brian had volunteered through the police department, as he did every year, but this time, he found himself drawn to Gabriel. After the event, they began to meet for coffee, discussing their shared dedication to the community and the burdens that came with their roles. Their conversations were deep, personal, and at times cathartic. Brian admired Gabriel's calm wisdom, and Gabriel in turn was drawn to Brian's quiet strength. Then, on October 9th, 2015, after an emotionally charged church service, their friendship crossed a line neither had expected. St. Michael's had hosted a vigil for a local family who had suffered a tragic accident, and emotions were running high. After everyone had left, Gabriel and Brian stayed behind in the dimly lit church, talking about the fragility of life and the struggles they faced. Gabriel, vulnerable and overwhelmed, opened up about his personal conflicts. His words struck a chord with Brian, who had been struggling with his own hidden desires for years. As the conversation deepened, there was a moment of silence that hung between them, charged with tension. Gabriel reached out, placing his hand on Brian's shoulder, a simple gesture meant to comfort. But the electricity between them was undeniable. Before they knew it, their connection had become physical. What started as a single kiss in the shadows of the church would soon spiral into something they could no longer control. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became more frequent, and their affair more intense. They met in secret, behind closed doors in the rectory, or in the dimly lit corners of Brian's office at the police station. Each time they met, they felt a rush of excitement and fear. Both men knew the risks they were taking. For Gabriel, every moment with Brian was a betrayal of his vows to God and the church. For Brian, it was a betrayal of his family, but neither of them could stop. By early January 2016, the weight of Gabriel's guilt had become unbearable. Every time he stood at the pulpit to deliver a sermon, he felt like a fraud. His prayers for forgiveness felt hollow, his faith wavering under the strain of his secret. Desperate to put an end to the affair, Gabriel called Brian to the rectory late one evening. "I can't do this anymore," Gabriel said, his voice thick with emotion. What we've been doing, it's tearing me apart." Gabriel's eyes were filled with pain, and for a moment, Brian thought he saw the priest crumbling before him. Brian nodded, knowing full well the toll the affair had taken on both of them. "You're right, it has to end," he agreed. But despite their best efforts, neither man could stay away for long. By February 2016, they had resumed their secret meetings, unable to resist the pull of their connection. Their desire for each other outweighed the guilt, but it also made them reckless. The risks were greater now, and both men were on edge. At home, Brian's relationship with Mary continued to deteriorate. His late nights were becoming more frequent, and his excuses, often involving work or sudden emergencies, were becoming more strained. Mary, always perceptive, had started asking more questions. "Brian, where have you been?" she would ask, her voice filled with concern. "I don't feel like I know you anymore." But Brian deflected, lying about being needed at the station or having to cover shifts for a colleague. On the night of March 3rd, 2016, Brian and Gabriel had a close call that left them both shaken. They had met in secret at the rectory, but as they talked in hushed voices, they heard footsteps approaching. Panic gripped them both. Gabriel quickly straightened his clothes, while Brian darted toward the back door. A fellow priest entered just moments later, unaware of how close he had come to discovering the truth. It was a reminder of how thin the veil of secrecy between them had become. Gossip had already begun to spread around Briar Ridge. Parishioners had noticed how often Brian and Gabriel were seen together outside of official church functions. There were whispers of something improper, though no one could say for sure. The small town, always so quick to judge, was buzzing with quiet speculation. By mid-March 2016, the tension had reached a boiling point. Gabriel could no longer handle the emotional weight of the affair, the constant push and pull between his faith and his forbidden desires. On the evening of March 17th, 2016, he made a final plea to Brian, calling him late at night. "We need to talk," Gabriel said, his voice betraying his desperation. "We can't leave things like this." Brian, feeling the strain of his double life, reluctantly agreed to meet him at the rectory. The air between them was tense when Brian arrived, the weight of everything they had hidden pressing down on them. "I can't do this anymore," Gabriel said, his voice breaking. "You can't just walk away from me after everything we've been through. It's not that simple." Gabriel's hands trembled as he spoke, his guilt and fear laid bare, but Brian was resolute. "It is over," he replied, his voice cold. "This has to stop, Gabriel. You know it does. We can't keep living like this." The conversation quickly escalated, emotions running high. Gabriel, desperate, grabbed Brian's arm, his voice rising. "I'll tell them," he threatened. "I'll tell everyone what we've done if you leave me." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Brian's heart raced as the threat of exposure loomed. Fear gripped him. If the affair came to light, it would destroy everything: his marriage, his career, his entire life. In a moment of panic, Brian shoved Gabriel backward, the force of the push sending him stumbling into the altar. "You won't say a word!" Brian shouted, his voice trembling with fear and rage. Gabriel, shocked by the sudden aggression, lunged forward again, but Brian snapped. Desperate to silence Gabriel, he grabbed a heavy brass candle holder from the altar and swung it with all his strength. At 11:15 p.m., the blow struck Gabriel's head with a sickening crack, and he crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Brian stood there, breathless, his hands trembling, the full weight of what he had just done settling over him like a shroud. Outside in the cold night air, Mary Connolly stood frozen in shock. She had followed Brian to the church that night, her suspicions finally pushing her to action. She had overheard everything: the argument, the threats, the sounds of the struggle. Now, as she stepped into the rectory, her eyes went wide with horror at the sight of her husband standing over Gabriel's lifeless body. "Brian, what have you done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible as the realization hit her. She turned to run, but Brian, gripped by panic, lunged toward her. At 11:30 p.m., he struck her with the same candle holder, the brutal force of the blow sending her crumpling to the floor. In a frenzy, Brian struck her again and again until the room was silent. The rectory, once a place of peace and prayer, was now a blood-soaked crime scene. Gabriel's body lay twisted near the altar, his clerical collar drenched in blood. Mary's lifeless form lay just feet away, her eyes wide with shock, frozen in death. Brian stood over them, his hands shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The gravity of what he had done began to sink in, and he sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the horror of his actions. On the morning of March 18, 2016, Father Thomas O'Reilly arrived at St. Michael's, as he did every day, to prepare for morning prayers. But as he approached the rectory, something felt off. The door was slightly ajar and a chill ran down his spine. Father Thomas pushed the door open, and the scene before him made him stagger backward in shock. Blood was everywhere, and the bodies of Father Gabriel and Mary Connolly lay lifeless on the floor. Shaking, Father Thomas dialed 911, barely able to speak. "There's been a murder. 2 murders," he stammered, his voice weak. By 8:15 a.m., the police had arrived at St. Michael's, cordoning off the area as detectives began their investigation. The crime scene was gruesome, blood splattered across the floor, the brass candle holder lying near the bodies covered in blood. Forensics teams began combing through the rectory, piecing together the horrific events of the previous night. The investigation quickly uncovered the secret affair between Father Gabriel and Officer Brian Connolly. Phone records revealed a series of late-night calls and messages between the two men, and interviews with parishioners confirmed the rumors that had been circulating for months. Friends of both men described their close relationship, but no one had suspected the depth of their connection. Brian, knowing there was no escape, turned himself in later that afternoon. At 2 p.m. on March 18, 2016, he walked into the Briar Ridge Police Department, his face pale and drawn. "I did it," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I killed them!" During his interrogation, Brian broke down, recounting the events of the night before in vivid detail. His hands shook as he described the argument, the panic, and the violence that followed. I didn't mean to kill them," he repeated, over and over again, as tears streamed down his face. The small town of Briar Ridge was left in shock. The revelation of the affair between their beloved priest and one of their most respected police officers shattered the community. What had once been a place of faith and trust was now the epicenter of a scandal that no one could have anticipated. In the days following the murders, Briar Ridge was a town in mourning, The revelation of the affair and the violent deaths of Father Gabriel and Mary Connolly sent shockwaves through the community. At St. Michael's, parishioners gathered for a vigil, their faces etched with grief and disbelief. The man they had trusted with their spiritual guidance had been living a lie, and his tragic death left them grappling with feelings of betrayal. At the Briar Ridge Police Department, officers held a separate memorial for Mary Connolly. Her family and friends were devastated by the loss, unable to comprehend how the man they had once trusted and loved could have taken her life. The weight of the tragedy was felt across the town as the media descended on Briar Ridge, turning the small, close-knit community into the subject of national headlines. For the residents of Briar Ridge, the sense of betrayal was profound. Father Gabriel had been a symbol of faith and morality, and his affair with Officer Connolly shattered that image. Mary's death only added to the pain, as the town struggled to reconcile the actions of the people they had once held in such high regard. The once peaceful town was now consumed by grief, anger, and confusion. The story of the double murder spread like wildfire, and the national media turned Briar Ridge into a spectacle. But for the people who had lived there, the tragedy was deeply personal. It wasn't just about the scandal, it was about the loss of 2 lives, the destruction of a family, and the shattering of a community's faith. In October 2016, Brian Connolly was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial had been swift, but the emotional toll it took on the town of Briar Ridge was immense. Throughout the proceedings, Brian's demeanor had shifted from cold detachment to overwhelming grief. His once strong facade had crumbled, leaving behind a broken man consumed by the weight of his actions. As the judge handed down the sentence, Brian's eyes were hollow, his spirit crushed by the enormity of what he had done. He had taken the lives of the 2 people he had loved the most, and now he would spend the rest of his life paying for that crime. The tragedy of Briar Ridge would not be forgotten. The affair between Father Gabriel and Officer Connolly, fueled by secrecy, guilt, and forbidden love, had led to a violent and devastating end. The consequences of their actions rippled through the town, leaving scars that would never fully heal. For the people of Briar Ridge, the memory of that fateful night in March would linger, a haunting reminder of how hidden desires and unspoken guilt can destroy lives and tear apart a community. The town, once built on trust and faith, was forever changed, its innocence lost in the shadow of the crimes that had shattered it.